We have a lot to learn from native indigenous cultures, but also I think we have a lot to learn from nature itself as explicated, I would say, and put it this way, by science's origin stories. Not necessarily all of them, but I would like to share a couple from my mother. And they're, the result of observation and compilation of many different disciplines, but they can be told as stories. And one possible slight corrective in the idea of the earth as an organism, you could say it's an organism, but also Gaia is more than an organism in the sense that it does some things that, and maybe also less, because it's not as coherent as a single organism, but more in the sense that it does things as a global ecosystem that no organism can do. And this is very important because the matter of which life is made must recycle as it uses the energy of the sun. And the energy of the sun is being transduced by plants. And plants and cyanobacteria, which are green bacteria, and algae, which are photosynthetic organisms in the ocean, are really they own the means of production. They're the only ones who make food. Everybody else is really a parasite, except maybe the chemolithotrophic bacteria. In the global ecosystem, everything is recycled. All the matter is recycled. No organism can live on its own waste matter. But Gaia, a superorganism, can and does. It's an ecosystem. It recycles completely. The big problem with industrial humanity is that it's growing so fast that it produces so much waste that it's starting to hurt itself. This has happened before in the history of Earth, and Earth has come back from it. Over evolutionary time, the environment, though I know there's a problem with that word, the outside, the home, let's say, the home can become the body. And there's a beautiful phrase, and I don't know where it comes from, that makes this point. It is that the earth is no more a rock with some life on it than you are a skeleton infested with cells. Over time, the home becomes the body because living beings grow into their surroundings and they incorporate them. A spectacular example of this is the creation of skeletons, both on the outside as an algae and the inside. Skeletons, our skeletons are made of calcium phosphate, apatite. Other skeletons of sea creatures, seashells, is calcium carbonate. This is something that is produced by life. But what's very interesting is that it used to be a waste product because calcium ions in cells in the early ocean have to be exported through the cells into the medium because they will be poisoned and die if they don't get rid of their calcium. So what looks like happened over evolutionary time is that the calcium built up on the outside of cells and became shells. And similarly, calcium exported became bones in ancestral organisms. So what used to be a waste product in our very bodies is now, outside bodies is now part of us. And that's what creative life can do over evolutionary time. There's a sculpture by the Spanish surrealist Salvador Dali that shows what looks like a skull, but really it's made out of 9 naked white women, and the feet are the teeth. And the space between the bodies look like the holes in the eye sockets of a skeleton. Well, this is similar to what life does. It makes one thing from another because it's economical. It reuses its materials. And even Dali himself, when he was making this sculpture, used his own brain, and the calcium ions in his brain are part of the electrochemistry of thought. So we're talking about an amazing global system that can reuse things. Another great example of a waste becoming used in the system is the production about 2 billion years ago of oxygen in the atmosphere. Before 2 billion years ago, Earth was probably looked reddish, not blue, because blue is a product of the scattering of oxygen atoms. And the cyanobacteria need a source of electrons. And so before that, there was bacteria that could use the gas that escaped from volcanoes, hydrogen sulfide, and hydrogen itself. And those gases were part of the means by which early life forms could photosynthesize. And there's still bacteria like that, purple sulfur bacteria, that don't use water, they use hydrogen sulfide. I mean, these green cyanobacteria were amazing, and they're still with us today. What other organisms can create food from nothing but air, carbon dioxide in the air, water, and sun? That's a pretty magical way to eat. And they are creating the food on this planet. Well, when they did that, life had lived in water before, but it had never used water as a part of its metabolism. When this new form of bacteria evolved to use water in its metabolism, it created a waste product, because you cannot have a life form without producing waste. It's a system that recycles matter and uses energy and produces waste into its environment. This is the problem, as Alton was telling us, that is a tendency of life to exponentially reproduce and produce too much waste. And this is what human beings are doing as a civilization. But life for human beings, and even in our own human bodies, has found ways to not do this. Ironically, all of our intelligence and our technology is making us go around the natural sort of controls, and also the living within the bounds of the ecosystem that the indigenous peoples do in the Amazon. That's not the case with global technological humanity. Well, but it has happened before, because there was always a tendency to grow too much. So there has to be ways to stop it. And perhaps the most spectacular tendency before us are these green bacteria that, when they started using water, which is H2O, they took the hydrogen and they got rid of the oxygen. They needed a source of hydrogen, and the oxygen began to build up in the atmosphere. And you can see this in the fossil record, because 2 billion years ago, you have uranium oxides and you have iron oxides, so-called red beds, rust in Earth's, in the rock record of Earth's rocks. And you can see that it began to oxidize. Before that, life existed, but not breathing oxygen. And as the oxygen rose, it rose from less than 1% to 20% of the atmosphere, which is where it is right now. And it's been regulated for hundreds of millions, about 2 billion years, to stay at 20%. That's why we have an energetic atmosphere. So this was a very dangerous gas, because oxygen, you can create fires in an oxygen atmosphere. You can burn hydrogen, oxygen rocket ships. When it appeared, it was very dangerous to the same organisms that were producing it. Again, this is similar to the human situation today, where we are endangered by our own waste. But life found a way to first to tolerate this oxygen, and some organisms couldn't tolerate it, and they went into the muds, and other organisms, and some came and now still exist, but inside the bodies of other organisms. For example, methanogens and archaea exist inside termites and inside cows. And in fact, they're the ones who are digesting the wood, part of the community that digests the wood inside termites, and of the community that digests the grass. So we can't eat grass, but cows can, because they have these early life forms that were poisoned by oxygen. But many of the cyanobacteria who were creating this were probably the first to suffer from the production of this waste gas. But now, this waste gas is all over the atmosphere, and we use its energy. So life is has amazing transformative powers, and I think that we could learn from this kind of adaptation to waste that are produced. Now, of course, one of the most important things that happen in the history of cell biology, the history of cells on Earth, is that there were some bacteria that evolved that could make use, not the cyanobacteria themselves, but of the oxygen directly. And those were the ancestors to the mitochondria. All of us outside the nucleus in our cells have mitochondria. The mitochondria come from the mother, but not from the father. They come in the egg cell. They're in the sperm cell, but the sperm only in the tail, and they break up. So when I'm talking to you today, I have not only my mother's green eyes, but my mother's mitochondria. That's giving me the energy with oxygen and food to speak these words. So when I'm speaking to you, my mother died, but not her mitochondria. So you could say she's sort of talking to you right now. This tendency of life to be able to use its waste and to grow and make a home and then make a body out of the home is something that we could learn from. As the New York ecologist, who actually has a company called Gaia Soil in the Bronx, and I've written with him, has suggested the 20,000 tons approximately of metal, water, glass, and I forget what the third thing is, but concrete that are produced every day in New York City alone. Well, we just take that and throw it in a dump. Well, compare that to what these algae did with their calcium, making it into their beautiful bodies, sometimes that look like Venetian blinds that let in the sun. We could take that and use it, say, to put it in the water and invite other species in. Instead of only thinking about ourselves and our little our square buildings and stuff, we could use that as a structure. With edges, you get more places for different kinds of organisms to grow. The Romans found, just as many peoples discovered when they dropped seeds on the ground and then the seeds grew into plants and they got agriculture, the Romans discovered that when they put these shells of oysters, the larvae would grow on them. Well, oysters and mussels are very good pollution cleaners, and that is the kind of thing that you could do to regenerate from our waste in a way that follows the example not only of overrunning your environment, which we learned from the Native American cultures, but from life itself, to use these wastes and create a new kind of life that's not just human, but incorporates many different species into it. And that, I think, is one of the things that we will have to do if we're going to go forward, especially with the population numbers we have now. I don't know how many people can understand me, so I don't want to go on too long. I would like to say that I liked the talk of ancestral futures, and I find that this is sort of a scientifically spiritual thing to think about that I'd like to share with you, that again comes from my mother. What I'm telling you mostly is a rehash of stuff that I learned from Lynn Margulis. But in scientific origin stories, if you like, of the origins of life, so you start with the earth, and the earth is concreting in the early solar system, about 4.5 billion years ago, as Fabio said, and at that time, the early solar system was mostly hydrogen because the sun came from hydrogen and then collapsed gravitationally and then became nuclear and started radiating light. But when life formed, it was in this early solar system that was much more hydrogen. And to this day, we are 70% water, which is hydrogen, H2O. So one thing that happens, and a fascinating thing about life is, as one of these thermodynamic systems that exists, and life is not the only one that exists by cycling matter as it uses energy in order to maintain its metabolism, the past continues. So our own bodies are similar to living museums of 4 billion years ago in the early solar system. The environments of life inside bodies is like the early solar system in the fact that it's made out of organic compounds that are hydrogen-rich compounds. Those sorts of environments you don't see in the early solar system. You do see them around the moons and the big planets in the outer solar system where gravity has been able to hold on to hydrogen, which is the lightest element, and so it tends to escape. And so when Earth, assuming that life evolved on Earth, it is containing past times. So it's something, again, to think about when we think about our ancestors, not just our human ancestors, but the ancestry of life itself is incorporated to this day in our own body. So we never escape the past. And maybe to finish, I should say a couple of words about entropy reduction and climate change, because I think that you can, there's a new view that, of climate change and global warming that is very interesting, and I'd like to share it with you. At first, put it in the context of this problem of exponential reproduction. My son, I have an 11-month old baby, and when he was 6 weeks, he doubled his weight from his birth weight. And so I calculated, if you doubled your weight every 6 weeks, I'm sorry, 8.6 periods of doubling, from his original birth weight of 8 pounds and 3 ounces, at 3 years, he would weigh, I think, 2,000 tons. So that's the kind of exponential growth that you do not see, because it doesn't happen. We have that problem too. When I was born, there was less than half the number of people on this planet as there are now. That's not going to continue. And unfortunately, one of the main ways that human beings seem to have evolved, though it's not sustainable, I don't think, of controlling their populations is to go to war and kill each other. That's pretty much the opposite of love. But this bombing is important in understanding this new view of climate change, because there was a front page graph in the New York Times that showed the global warming from 1880 to 2017, about 3 degrees centigrade. And it was published, and a scientist I know looked at it and noticed that, I don't think it was him, he interpreted it, but during this gradual rise, there was something very interesting. In 1940, there was the gradual rise increased, and then there was a steep rise till 1945, and then it went back down, and then it continued. Well, carbon dioxide has a long residence time in the atmosphere, so it couldn't be from carbon dioxide that it shot up like that. But what it could have been from is particles in the atmosphere. And those particles were produced by bombs, and they would have peaked in 1945 when the Hiroshima and Nagasaki bombs and the end of World War II happened. So this suggests that you need to look at particles in the atmosphere. When they're measured, they do increase heat. When the Mount St. Helens volcano erupted, it was cooler in the daytime because it was blocking the light, but it was even more warm than it was cooler in the daytime at night because the particles trapped the heat from the earth and from the sun and then re-radiated it at night. So it's very possible that the reason that the earth is warming up right now is not entirely because of carbon dioxide, but because of pollution particles in the atmosphere from industrial technology. And that's important just basically as a new way of understanding a possible explanation, and also hopeful because, as in the chart, it came down from 1945 to 50. If you get rid of particulate pollution, which comes from gasoline additives, mostly from coal, fly ash when they don't trap coal, and also from geoengineering, if they happen to be spraying something in the atmosphere, maybe even thinking that they're making it cooler, they could be warming the planet. But if you got rid of those, according to the authors of this paper, you could relatively rapidly bring down what we see as global warming. Another aspect of this is that the thermodynamic systems of which life is an example in science are called open thermodynamic system or complex thermodynamic systems. They're finding energy, and all life, even life that stays in its environment without destroying it, is always needing energy, needing food, and producing waste. But these systems are not only confined to life. Storm systems also do this. They find energy represented by pressure gradients in the atmosphere, or temperature gradients in the atmosphere, or electron potential gradients, as life does, and make beautiful little chemical reactions. In one case, such a chemical reaction was being carried by a scientist named Bill Early at Georgetown University, which is a Jesuit school. And he was on the elevator, and he saw these beautiful spiraling chemical reactions called Belousov-Zhabotinsky reactions. And a couple of priests got on the elevator, and one of them looked at the experiment he was carrying and then looked at him and said, "Are those alive?" And the scientist thought about it for a second and said, no, Father, they're just like you. They metabolize, but they don't reproduce." So these kinds of systems are not confined to life. And one of these kinds of systems is called a convection cell. Well, when the Portuguese marineros discovered, because there was already people here, obviously, but when they came to the New World, they were taking advantage of the currents that you can see on the maps, on the weather maps in Europe. And those currents are an example of a simple, so to speak, a simple complex thermodynamic system that is dissipating heat. It's called a convection cell. Well, this happens on many different scales in Earth's atmosphere. If you have a high temperature at the bottom and a lower temperature at the top, you can get patterns that elegantly transport heat. Heat is the ultimate form of waste in a thermodynamic system. Beyond liquid, gas, and solid waste, heat becomes this final form of waste when you can't use the energy anymore. Well, these convection cells in the atmosphere that actually brought Europeans over because they put their sails there, they are being disrupted by the production of heat by human technological civilization, it looks like. For example, it's also been shown that the winds that blow the dust off the Sahara Desert into the North Atlantic become very hot because they're stopping convection. In a high school experiment, if you take a beaker of liquid and you heat it up and put celery seeds in it, you can see the convection patterns, the smooth transport of heat. But if you put a plate on the top of it, it stops and you get no more convection. Well, we could also be stopping convection with our particulate pollution. So it's ironic that even simple non-living systems such as convection are in some ways better at taking care of their waste than we are. And you could also argue that the intelligence of using energy but not using it up is something that we need to apprentice ourselves to. And I'll just conclude by saying a couple of words about the idea of the jinn or the genie. In medieval Islam, the genies, like in the Thousand Nights and One Night, the Nights of Arabia, well, they were made of fire. They can be made of fire. And a fire is a kind of form of thermodynamic system that uses its energy and then it disappears. But they would often manifest as whirlpools. Well, whirlpools, like even over there, you can see a spiral that's a kind of a whirlpool. They are also a kind of thermodynamic system that are using energy gradients and then cycling, and then when they finish and the energy, potential energy that's there is used up, they too disappear. That's what we seem to be doing, not just as all humans, but as the technological humans that are ruining the environment, mostly for themselves. I wouldn't say for the planet itself. The planet itself has come back from multiple mass extinctions. The Yucatan asteroid that landed in the sea floor beneath the Yucatan, that is, I think, billions of times more powerful than the Hiroshima bomb. And we have more life after that now than we did before. So I wouldn't worry about the planet. We need to worry about ourselves and learn from the planet and learn from peoples who don't overgrow their environment. In our current state, we are like the medieval genies that are fires or whirlpools. They use it all up and then they're gone. I think we should be more like the organisms, the recycling organisms of the earth that tap into these energy gradients and have ways of continuing to do so, to keep on doing it in the future without destroying themselves in the process. Thank you.